Mr. Sharul Anas Ismail, Chargé of the Embassy of Brunei Darussalam. Mr. Zainal Arifin, Minister Counselor of the Embassy of Indonesia. Ms. Daphne Teo, Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Singapore. Mr. Toan, representative from the Embassy of Vietnam. Mr. Shigehiro Matsuda, Third Secretary of the Embassy of Japan. Ms. Lynn Resurrection, President of the Philippine Science Journalists Association. Director Lim, Director Lim is represented by Director Ramon, Nelson de Valadera. We have from the Embassy of Malaysia. Not here. Okay. Let me now go to the meat of the program. For our opening remarks, may I call on Ms. Clarissa Arida, Program Development and Implementation Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity.
Honorable Undersecretary, Undersecretary, National Representing Secretary Ramon Fan, Excellencies from the ASEAN Member States, representatives from the European Union, representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs, our Executive Director Rodrigo Pentes and ACD colleagues, our friends from the media, business and conservation organizations, friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook. About 2 years ago, we had the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity ask ourselves, how is the ASEAN region faring in the global challenge of significantly reducing the loss of biodiversity by 2010? This question was followed by a series of questions. Are we doing what is right? Or have we gone in different directions? Is there hope for biodiversity to flourish in this region? 2 years ago, we also asked, what are the prospects for biodiversity beyond 2010, given the targets set by the countries under the UN Convention on Biodiversity? These are the questions that the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook attempted to answer. Many of us are familiar with the facts and figures embodied in the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which was launched last year by the Convention on the Biodiversity Secretariat. With Southeast Asia's well-recognized richness in biological resources and its impact on the global environmental sustainability, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity and the 10 ASEAN member states saw the importance of coming up with a report, the Outlook, focusing on the Southeast Asian region. Our work on the report commenced in 2008, when the ASEAN member states began identifying suitable biodiversity indicators at the regional and the national levels. In a series of regional workshops and consultations on biodiversity indicators, we aim to monitor the progress of reducing the rate of biodiversity loss by 2010. Some of these indicators were used by the ASEAN member states in preparing their fourth national reports submitted by countries to the UN Convention on Biodiversity. In analyzing the data presented by the ASEAN countries in its national reports to the UNCBD, as well as the fourth ASEAN State of the Environment report, which was prepared by the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, including the third Global Biodiversity Outlook and numerous other sources. We look into the status and trends across all ecosystems, the pressures faced by its ecosystem, as well as the responses initiated to address these pressures. We at ACB also attempted to present a snapshot of some of the actions by the ASEAN nations in combating the loss of biodiversity. Today, you will hear about the key findings and the recommendations presented in the Outlook. It is now 2011, and 2011 to 2020 has been declared as the UN Decade for Biodiversity by the United Nations. It is our hope that the facts and figures and the outlook you will learn today will trickle down and lead to informed choices, decisions, and actions across all sectors. We hope that through the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook, we will also be encouraged to take advantage of the opportunities for collaboration to realize our common purpose of conserving the natural resources in the region. Given the representations in this room from the excellencies and representatives from the European Union, the ASEAN member states, and NGOs and national organizations and the media, let us all remember that we have a choice to make, and we have to make it now. We need to choose our lives and those of future generations. This will only be possible if we start caring for biodiversity now. Again, on behalf of the entire ACB team, thank you very much for joining us today. Mabuhay at magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat.
May we also acknowledge the presence of the Third Secretary of the Embassy of Laos, Mr. Wilaivan Saisong. May I now call on Ms. Lynn Resurrection, President of the Philippine Science Journalists Association, to deliver her message.
Mr. Rod Fuentes, DNR Undersecretary Demetrio Ignacio, Your Excellencies, representatives of the DFA, Mr. Rolling Shong, good morning. The Philippine Science Journalists Association Incorporated would like to thank the ACB for inviting us to be its media partners on this launching of the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook in the Philippines. SciJourn recognizes the need to protect biodiversity and combat its loss. We want to contribute to this endeavor by disseminating information to the people through our news and feature stories in the print media, broadcast, cyber media, so the Filipinos will be properly informed. Actually, during our celebration of the Science Journalists Week in 2010, last year, in the celebration of the International Year of Biodiversity, SciJourn had the protection of biodiversity as its theme. And this year, during our Congress, which falls on the 10th year of SciJourn's formation, on the International Year of the Forest, we will have the protection of the forest as our theme, to highlight the need to protect the forest in the country, which has rich biodiversity. Indeed, the publication of ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook and its launching now in the Philippines will contribute to the enrichment of information that we, the journalists, will disseminate to the people. The findings featured in the Outlook, such as the status and trends across all ecosystems, the pressures faced by each ecosystem, as well as the responses initiated to address these pressures by each of the 10 ASEAN countries, provide a rich material for us to learn from and write about. The Outlook is indeed a rich tool for us journalists to generate awareness on the status of biodiversity in the Philippines and in the ASEAN region. We hope that the stories that we will write or the broadcast materials that we will air will do justice to each and every findings of the researchers in the report. Allow us to congratulate ACB for putting out the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook. Congratulations to ACB for the success of its launching. Thank you very much.
Honorable Demetrio Ignacio, Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He's representing Secretary Ramon Pai.
Good morning, Your Excellencies, our friends in the media, business, non-government organizations, fellow workers in conservation, ladies and gentlemen. ASEAN is a region that we can all be proud of. It is rich in natural resources. Our region comprises only 3% of the world's land area, but it is home to 20% of all plant and animal species or biodiversity on Earth. 3 of the 18 megadiverse countries in the world can be found in ASEAN: Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. These countries are also part of the Coral Triangle, considered the richest marine area in the world. Majority of the species in the region are unique and cannot be found anywhere else. Its biodiversity is full of superlatives: the biggest, the smallest, the tallest, the shortest, the largest, the leanest, the meanest, and the most docile. ASEAN biodiversity provides food, medicine, shelter, and many materials for its people, for its neighbors, and for the rest of the world. It is estimated that 40% of the world's economy and 80% of the needs of the poor are taken from biodiversity. Therefore, great responsibilities are placed upon ASEAN to protect it and conserve and sustainably utilize our biodiversity. To do this, ASEAN has a network of 1,343 protected areas, of which 28 are declared ASEAN Heritage Parks. 3 of the heritage parks are in the Philippines: Mount Apo, our highest mountain and home of the Philippine eagle; Mount Iglit-Baco in Mindoro, home of our tamarao; and Mount Kitanglad, the source of an anti-malaria drug. In fact, the cure for many diseases will likely be found in the forests and seas of Southeast Asia. Biodiversity in our region, however, is under severe stress. The habitat of our biodiversity, our forests, our seas, continue to be degraded. The advent of climate change poses more threats to our biodiversity. Today, we will hear the status of biodiversity in the ASEAN region. I hope we will hear some positive developments. What is clear is that we need to do more. We need to re-examine our production and consumption patterns to make our choices more responsible and environment friendly. We need to increase awareness on the need to protect our ecosystems. Biodiversity loss is a transboundary issue. ASEAN and its principles of solidarity, unity, and partnership is actually in the best position to protect and promote biodiversity. The ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook will guide us to explore opportunities for collaborations and partnership at the national and regional level. At the end of the day, biodiversity is more than just biodiversity. It is more about food security, it is more about better health, it is more about social equity, it is more about poverty alleviation, it is our natural heritage. We congratulate the ACB for the completion of the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook. Let us strengthen our partnership to ensure that our people and our children benefit from our rich natural resources. Maraming salamat.
At this point, may we invite the Director Rodrigo Fuentes of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity to turn over a copy of the outlook, the report, to Undersecretary Ignacio. And may I ask our ASEAN representatives to come up and have the photo opportunity at the same time. It is our coffee break. Please come up, all of those at this table. May I now ask Mr. Rodrigo Fuentes, Executive Director, to deliver his report.
Thank you, Bill. Your Excellencies, Undersecretary Ignacio, friends, colleagues, and co-workers in the field of biodiversity. Pleasant good morning to everyone. Isang magandang araw sa inyong lahat. We are extremely pleased to have you here in our launching of the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook. This was a product of several work coming from the ASEAN member states themselves. I think Director Arida had already mentioned as to how we've done this work. And at this juncture, we would like to express our gratitude for the support that we have received coming from the ASEAN member states, coming from the other organizations to come up with these publications. From EU, from the government of Japan, and all other bilateral institutions and multilateral institutions. Our friends from the NGO community, both at the international and national level, who have provided us valuable information of putting together all this information and try to paint a picture of what the real situation is insofar as the region is concerned. We consider this publication as our modest contribution to the global effort of trying to address the key issues on biodiversity. Many of the points have already been taken and have already been emphasized by our earlier speakers. Now I have the pleasure of presenting to you what this outlook contains. Let me begin with what's the framework for our assessment. Perhaps many of you are quite familiar with what they call the Driver Pressure Impact State Response Framework. And it's the same framework that we have used, wherein we've identified what the driver of biodiversity loss. From that, of course, there are simultaneous impact. The drivers are not only coming from one source, but it's coming from many sources. And the simultaneous impacts of this driver will therefore intensify pressures on biodiversity. The intensity and expanse of pressure defines the state or the condition of that biodiversity resource. The conditions, therefore, depending on how they are, if they are pristine, then that is fine. If, however, as we all know, that necessarily if there are pressures on many of these ecosystems, it could elicit response to society, or from society, from governments, from communities, and even from the global perspective. Such response could be negative or positive, but in any way, the kind of pressure that is placed on this ecosystem will basically define how that state of ecosystem will look like. On the part of society, as responses are elicited, there could be appropriate or inappropriate responses. And what we're trying to look at, particularly on the part of government, are the appropriate policy responses in order to somehow address the issues or alleviate the drivers, the causes of such pressures, or try to expand the driver that causes or that influences a positive reflex or influence on the ecosystem. Guided by this framework, therefore, the outline of the ASEAN Biodiversity Outlook shall be the following. Your first portions will talk about what the drivers are. It will discuss the pressures from these drivers to the ecosystem and what its impacts. From these impacts, then it defines what's the altered state of the ecosystem. And from this, what had been the response to the challenges of biodiversity conservation from an ASEAN standpoint. And there are many. What is the relevance of Southeast Asia's biodiversity? I think Undersecretary Ignacio had already cited some of the facts. We say that this region occupies only 3% of the Earth's surface, but we are home to 3 mega-diverse countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We have several biogeographical units that are found in the region. The Malaysia, Wallacea, Sundaland, Indo-Burma, Central Indo-Pacific. Its characteristic is that the resources that are found here are quite common. And therefore, that's what makes it unique. We are home to about 20% of the plants and animal species assessed. We wish to emphasize the word assessed. This is only what we do know. There's still a lot of things that we do not know by IUCN. And we have 1/3 of the coral reef areas in the world. But the region is likewise confronted with massive habitat and species loss. 4 of the world's 34 biodiversity hotspots are found in the region. Out of the 47,000 species that are threatened, 2,500 of them are in the region. Again, here in this context is as assessed by IUCN. So how did the ASEAN fare with respect to the 2010 biodiversity target? it's mixed. We have achieved progress in expanding the coverage of the terrestrial and marine protected areas. We have a network of protected areas, and one of them is the ASEAN Heritage Parks. And there are several other sub-regional clusters of protected areas that are found in the region. We have developed a number of capacities for expanding the network of wildlife enforcement. And this has been achieved through collaboration between two countries and among the ASEAN members themselves, recognizing that enforcement is not an issue of one country alone, but enforcement is an issue that is better appreciated if member countries would collaborate and partner with each other. However, we also acknowledge that we have not adequately addressed a number of issues that still confront us with respect to biodiversity conservation. There's a growing concern on invasive alien species as they try to threaten many of our endemic species. We have somehow still lacking in trying to address the impact of biodiversity loss on the species and ecosystems. The context of now looking at ecosystems as a fundamental management or a fundamental area for biodiversity management is just starting to be acknowledged. Abating pollution and the exploitation of forests and wetlands continue to be key issues within the region. So what are the drivers and pressure points? This is a simplistic presentation of what are the key drivers of biological loss in the region. You have habitat change. Climate change is, of course, a little more on a global basis. We have invasive alien species, overexploitation, pollution, and poverty. If you will note, some of these issues, or most of these issues, are concerns in which we as society ourselves can do something about. Except perhaps for climate change and invasive alien species, in which the possible impact could be irreversible. The others, however, is something that we can do about. Let's look at habitat change. Habitat destruction from forests through forest fires and marine and coastal habitats modified through the use of destructive fishing gear practices. For forests, its pressure points are infrastructure development from hotels, housing, roads, large-scale planting of high-value crops, and large-scale intensive coastal aquaculture. For marine, you have the use of explosives, the use of bottom trawlers, which threatens many of our pristine coastal marine areas. For invasive alien species, there could be intentional introductions, imports of species to increase food production, like in the aquaculture industry, or in the aquarium industry, which perhaps many of you may not realize is a huge industry. And then there's the unintended introductions that could come from ballast water, ships that are docking in many of our coastal regions, maybe bringing some of these unintended species and tend to overcome or tend to invade a number of our ecosystems. For hitchhikers, what we call a hitchhikers is that, as in the context of hitchhiking, we don't know that they are there, or we unintentionally welcome them and then suddenly they drop off. Some of these species are like that. Overexploitation. You have overharvesting of natural stocks, hunting for bushmeats, wildlife trade, or overfishing. The illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing practices, poaching, or use of destructive means of fishing. For pollution, you have industrial wastes, domestic wastes, agriculture, coming from livestock wastes, insecticides or fertilizer runoffs, and increases in carbon emissions brought about by climate change or ocean acidification. These pressure points conspire, basically, together to put pressure on our biological resources. So what's the state of our ASEAN biodiversity? Let's look at the forest ecosystems. The forest ecosystem is fundamentally what we call an overgrown natural wealth. We have overgrown. If it's a bank, we have basically have already a negative draft, perhaps, with respect to our forest ecosystems. There's an increasing per capita consumption of forest products, as noted by the increase in wood-based panels. We're not only talking of logs here, because sometimes we tend to see that forests are related to just logs, trees, and that. But for this purpose, we're looking at logs are produced or are cut or is a product of timber being cut in the forest, and from that timber, various products are generated. And one among them, if we're not using lumber, one of them are wood-based panels. We're not yet talking of charcoal. We're not talking yet of all other non-forest products. We're just talking of for forest products on wood-based panels. Our per capita consumption of wood-based panels have been increasing. Paper and paperboard have likewise been increasing. This is one indication that the increased use of paper is related to our current consumption patterns. And then, against a backdrop of a decreasing forest area. So you have your increasing demand for many wood products. At the same time, the very source in which you're getting these forest products are decreasing. What are the critical pressure points? Logging and timber harvesting. We're not saying this is a very general identification. Logging and timber harvesting, meaning it both includes what we call the legal, and what makes it worse are the illegals. The legal is something in which we can regulate as governments. There's a need, basically, for the use of some of these products. But what about the illegal removal of timber from these areas? You have fires, conversion for agricultural use, human settlement and infrastructure development, mining and mineral resource extraction, invasive alien species in forest areas, poaching and illegal wildlife trade, slash and burn farming. Agroecosystems. It's an emerging hotspot. There's an increasing trend in the production and consumption of major agricultural commodity products. Eggs, vegetables, cereals, meat. There's also an increasing trend in the trade of agricultural products. Because of this, around 8% of our major livestock breeds are becoming extinct in the ASEAN region. The critical pressure points for agroecosystems is the replacement of indigenous varieties and breeds of plants and animals, the globalization of agricultural products, habitat destruction, pest infestation, and diseases. These therefore have implications on food security. And one aspect that we have to look at when we talk of agroecosystems, we have to understand resiliency on the part of our ecosystems. The replacement and the introduction of high-yielding varieties to meet increasing global demand for food is slowly replacing some of the more resilient species that we have. And this is becoming, or should become, a key concern, particularly for a region that is very much dependent on agriculture. Peatlands. It is now being recognized to be an increasingly valuable ecosystem. About 250,000 square meters of peatlands, or around 60% of the world's tropical peatlands, or about 1/10 of the total global peatland resource, are found in the region. And majority of the peatlands are located in Indonesia, which has over 70% of the total peatlands cover of the region. The critical pressure points, of course, are conversion of human activities, oil palm plantations or agricultural plantations and settlements, the vulnerability of these areas from fires, and climate change. Most of our wetlands are found in the peatlands, and therefore their value as an ecosystem cannot be underemphasized. Inland waters by itself is a unique ecosystem, and it could be the next flashpoint for the region. Not all countries in the globe are benefited with fresh water. And fortunately for the region, we have many freshland ecosystems. But unfortunately also, because of pressure, we are starting to undermine these freshwater ecosystems. We have around 29 freshwater ecoregions. The Australasia realm has 3 freshwater ecoregions that has tropical and subtropical coastal rivers that are found in Sulawesi and the East Timor sub-region. The critical pressure points, land conversion, and highly dense population. Mangroves, a critical support ecosystem. Mangroves occupy around 60,000 square kilometers that are found in the region. It is home to 52 true mangrove species, wherein 2 are listed as critically endangered and endangered. Our mangroves are likewise increasing in terms of the size all over the region. Critical pressure points, deforestation due to the domestic demand for fuel and materials for housing, and the conversion of mangrove forests to either fish or prawn funds for commercial consumption. Coral reefs, the marine forests. It spans to around 86,000 square kilometers that are in the region. We account for about 1/3 of the global total, which is 11 times larger than the aggregated coral reef area cover of China, India, and Japan. Our hard coral diversity is high in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam, and where a total of almost 600 species of hard corals are found. Critical pressure points are overexploitation, pollution, sedimentation, and tourism. Seagrasses. For many, or for some of us, this may come rather as a new area, seagrass, as an ecosystem. They play a very critical role in terms of protecting our coastal habitats. 18 of the world's 60 seagrass species are found in this region. 33% of all seagrasses areas are found here. And seagrasses area cover a range from 46,000 to 58,000 square kilometers. Critical pressure points: bottom trawling, extensive coastline destruction and modification, the decline in the coastal water quality, and human-induced development. Seagrass among the ecosystems and among the coastal ecosystems or subcoastal ecosystems is the least understood of the coastal canneries. And with respect to adding to that pressure point is that 10% of the target for seagrass conservation in the region have not been met. How, therefore, have we responded from the state and conditions of our critical ecosystems? For protected areas, in which we're trying to conserve the last frontiers, the designation of protected areas have increased by 98% in terms of area and by 89% in terms of number. We have identified as well around 700 or 800 key biodiversity areas in the region. And many countries are now trying to establish more marine protected areas where the vast marine resources exist. There is a collaboration on the establishment of transboundary protected areas. As mentioned by Undersecretary Ignacio, we have 28 ASEAN heritage parks, 3 of them are found in the Philippines. We have the Coral Triangle Initiative on coral reefs, fisheries, and food security, the Sulu-Sulawesi Marine Ecoregions, the Heart of Borneo Initiative, Greater Sub-Mekong Region, Greater Mekong Sub-Region, the Transboundary Protected Areas Initiative on the Heart of Borneo, the Turtle Island Heritage Protected Areas, the Sulu-Sulawesi Marine Ecoregions, Transboundary Law Enforcement, and ASEAN. All of this are initiatives that are being taken by the region to somehow conserve the last frontiers. Then there's also a collaboration on wildlife enforcement, in which there is the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network. It's the world's largest wildlife enforcement network. And it is needed because this region is also the center of illegal wildlife trade. There's an integrated network of law enforcement agencies with CITES authorities, customs, police, prosecutors, specialized government wildlife law enforcement organizations, and other relevant national law enforcement agencies functioning and working together, collaborating, connecting, and communicating as they need to partner with each other. On the scientific side, the ASEAN has built its capacity on taxonomy. I mentioned earlier as to how many species are known. There's still a lot of things that needs to be unknown, that are still unknown. they need to be named. And we need people, scientific, who have good scientific backgrounds, to be able to name what these species are. So we need to build capability on taxonomy. We more or less are collaborating with a number of countries in this capability building, and we would like to cite our gratitude to the government of Japan in this effort in terms of building capacity in the region on taxonomy. There's an ASEAN framework and agreement on access and benefit sharing. At the COP10, one of the milestone agreements that came out is what they call the Nagoya Protocol, which is a protocol that deals with what would be the rules for equitably and accessing genetic biodiverse materials. Prior to this regime, the ASEAN had already acknowledged that they need to somehow collaborate with each other with respect to granting access and making sure that the benefits of genetic materials are equitably distributed. And so, the ASEAN, even prior to the Nagoya Protocol, have already agreed that there should be a framework agreement within the region that would guide on how do we make sure that access and benefit sharing are guaranteed. And the region has more or less worked on this, and we are glad to help the region to continue the building of capacity towards the translation now of the Nagoya Protocol. The ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Blueprint, which ensures environmental sustainability, is the framework in which it identifies the roadmap as to how countries will be able to somehow respond to the issues of the biodiversity challenge. And in a way, by coming up with this roadmap, the governments in the region have somehow have a clear commitment, apart from the global commitments that they have, into incorporating environmental concerns in many of their development discussions. And of course, many or the 10 ASEAN member states are signatory to a number of multilateral environmental agreements. Next slide, please. We are, the 10 member states are a member or a party to the Convention on Biodiversity. Some member states are a party to CITES, to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, to the World Heritage, and Ramsar. One of the clear expression of commitment of the ASEAN member state towards biodiversity conservation is their agreement to establish the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. This was done in 2005, and this center, this agreement, came into force following the ratification of 6 member states in 2009, which is a clear indication of how the ASEAN member states are really bent on trying to collaborate efforts with respect to biodiversity conservation. The center has a key mandate of facilitating and coordinating efforts on biodiversity. And among others, we have supported many countries in undertaking joint research initiatives on biodiversity. We have conducted a number of policy study support to help them position themselves, meaning the countries, in the international discussions on biodiversity. We have done a number of capacity building, course programs for protected area workers, and we have developed biodiversity information sharing service, and at the same time, clearinghouse mechanisms for Southeast Asia, with the intent that governments in the region would see the wisdom of sharing this information, and from this information, making it available to planners, to policymakers, even to users, so that they would understand what the situation is and how they would be able to contribute to biodiversity conservation. For public affairs and education, we have tried to promote the values of biodiversity. We have several publications, technical papers that have been produced and that is shared not only to institutions but to countries as well, and to individuals who are interested on certain key issues or certain topics relating to biodiversity. One of the highlights that we had was the convening of the ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity in 2009, wherein we brought in policymakers, scientists, and the general public in Singapore to discuss not only the progress in achieving the 2010 biodiversity target, but how can we move forward in terms of addressing issues relating to climate change and biodiversity, the ABS, wherein at the time prior to the Nagoya was still being negotiated, the new economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, wherein which we're now trying to promote the idea that we need to put values on these ecosystems. And a seminal work that was supported 2 or 3 years ago on the ecosystems and the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which they call the TEEB study, had been launched several years back, and some of the findings, or many of the key findings, were likewise launched during the COP10 or Nagoya work in Japan in October. Now we need to somehow embed or operationalize some of the principles that have been identified in the TEEB study and try to see how it can be done in our respective countries. Moving forward, what have been the lessons from the ASEAN experience? First is that we need to sustain the current efforts on our ecosystems approach to biodiversity conservation by capitalizing on the political support to large regional programs. The ASEAN as a group had already clearly put this forward, and this needs to be sustained. Second, we need to take pride on the natural and cultural heritage of the ASEAN member states. One of them is that the Heritage Parks program is a program that we feel would be a good flagship to showcase ASEAN solidarity, but likewise pride on the countries that they have this kind of ecosystems. We need to reach out and reach to the unconverted. It's pointless to be discussing about biodiversity conservation to people who are already involved and truly believes on the idea. We need to somehow spread the gospel, as what they call it, and bring in all the other players that are key to putting pressures and at the same time perhaps providing solutions to many of our issues. We need to engage a greater number of biodiversity stakeholders in conservation initiatives and now seriously mainstream biodiversity into sectoral development plans. Perhaps it's time to also talk about biodiversity to our finance managers, to our economic managers, to our political advisors, and all other critical sectors that can make decisions that will influence or significantly impact on these ecosystems. Work must also be done on valuing seriously biodiversity and now acknowledge the concept of ecosystem services. It's not only looking at forests as forests, or coastal areas as coastal areas. I think it is now time that these ecosystems, it's now time to recognize that these ecosystems are interconnected to each other. And if we were, as a society, we don't say that we cannot progress without having to use these resources. Definitely, we cannot. We have to use them, but we have to use them sustainably, economically, and efficiently. Not only thinking of our needs, but the needs for future generations, which may sound already as a cliche, but it's a fact. The only way in which we can do this is when we start to really recognize values of ecosystems. And we're not only talking of acknowledging it from a standpoint of the economic values, but acknowledging the non-economic values of ecosystem and factor them in our development prospects. Access and benefit sharing. There's already a protocol that has been done. We need to learn already from that protocol, and we need to somehow position ourselves as to how we can operationalize this. Some countries have started to do that. In the Philippines, Malaysia have their ABS rules already. But there are countries within the region that needs to look into how they can make sure that this global protocol can be of value to them. Business of biodiversity by engaging the private sector to invest in ecosystem services. Business, I think at this time, recognize that many of them base their economic activities or their manufacturing or industrial activities on many of these ecosystems. Along with trying to put value in these ecosystems, the private sector can perhaps be in a better position to likewise help in our effort to addressing many of these key issues, because just as local governments are very much connected to many of these resources, many businesses are very much reliant on these resources as well. In many ways, they can therefore be asked to be a partner on how to conserve these ecosystems. Lastly, the championing of biodiversity by every sector, in which we need to communicate, and the challenges of educating the entire society and the full value of biodiversity. With that, if you need to find out more of what the state and what the outlook would be of the biodiversity in the region, we will now all welcome you to access and get hold of this publication. It's available in our website. I think for all of you among here, we will also distribute to you the CDs, and try to see and read this, as we can guarantee you there's very rich information that you can get from here. And hopefully from this outlook, we would be better informed as to how we would be able, as a society, as a responsible member of the society, can contribute to the conservation of our rich biological diverse resources in the region. Thank you very much.
May we recognize the presence of Attorney Meg Tangan, representative from the office of Senator Lauren Legata, who is the chairman of Environment and Natural Resources Affairs in the Senate. Miss, here she is. Thank you. Well, you have heard the good news and the bad news. And when we look at each other after listening to the report, it looks like the culprits are no other than me and you, or you and me. Because the common thing that came out in the report is development is indeed there and must be. It's needed, but it's also the people who need this development. So we now throw open the floor to the open forum. And the open forum lasts until noontime, when we shall have lunch of PZRH. And
I'm here as I chair the new task force on climate change and disaster preparedness of the Management Association of the Philippines, and I head Earth Institute Asia. My program at DZRH is on hold at present after 4 years, but we will be relaunching it soon, maybe directly through the internet. First, I'd like to congratulate the ASEAN Biodiversity, ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, and particularly its head, who has been working very hard. Congratulations, Rod. I have 3 interrelated questions and an invitation. Number 1 is, we have, I'm sure we are all familiar, I hope we are, with the new program of the Climate Change Commission with 2 growth engine strategies, and one of which is the development of eco-towns in protected areas. I'd like to know what the comment is of the center on this strategy, and if this has been coordinated with you, and how can we be sure that in implementing it we will be able to support the objectives of the ASEAN Biodiversity Program. The second question that I have is, what is the program now of the Center on Biodiversity and Disaster Preparedness? One issue that was brought up in our meeting yesterday is that we are providing, for example, shelters for human beings for during disaster periods. But what about animals? And so I asked, what about our biodiversity species, especially those that we are trying to protect because they are becoming extinct? No? What are we doing about that? And thirdly is that I noticed in your program, in the magazine, that there is an article on GMOs, biotech business, and it sounds like an implicit endorsement of the business, no, with $10.5 billion. But as we know, Greenpeace and other NGOs are very much against this, no. So what is really the stand? And lastly, we're trying in the business sector to do something about climate change and relating it to sustainable livelihood. And we're focusing on Pantabangan in Nueva Ecija, and we'd like to invite the center to participate in this, how we may be able to do the work while at the same time enhancing, not only conserving, but enhancing our biodiversity, if we can do that. And to the general audience, I'd like to invite you to the Business Summit, those of you who are from the business sector, on climate change, which will be held on the 29th. That's a whole day event. And this reminds me that we should put biodiversity in the agenda, because I don't believe that we are really discussing that biodiversity and climate change. There is a survey who are from the business sector here. It's very important for business companies to fill up this survey that the PricewaterhouseCoopers is conducting. It's a global survey that we are participating in, and that will be an important input into the summit. So if you have questions on that, let me know.
Who would you want to answer? Rod?
I guess Rod and whoever.
Rod, it's your turn. And whoever wants to participate, comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cora, for the points that you have raised as well. I may not be able to respond clearly on some of the protected areas. There will be certain elements as to how do you make sure that the biodiversity resources that are in these protected areas are really protected in that sense. So therefore, we would be very happy to somehow try to work out and try to understand what it is. Of course, many of our efforts in relation to protected areas are really building on capacities, particularly for governments and key stakeholders, how they would be able to meet their commitment to ensuring that the protected areas are really protected. There is, as signatory to the CBD, there is what they call the program of work on protected areas. Therefore, governments are committed to meet the requirements for this under this set program. And it might be interesting that we have to probably look as to the compatibility of this approach to eco-towns in protected areas to the program of work. And if ever they are really along that line, then perhaps it can be offered as one of the key measures for compliance to the program of work. And we would be somehow interested to look into this. The other question relates to what is the program of ECB on disaster preparedness. We haven't looked into this as well, but we do know that in many of these ecosystems, their value for disaster prevention are very, very high. Mangroves, for instance, they serve as buffers for coastal disasters like tsunamis or whatever. And within the region, many governments, I think, have their commitment in terms of addressing key issues relating to mangrove rehabilitation. And perhaps one of the key areas that would come along would be tapping in mangrove rehabilitation in the context of disaster prevention. And I'm pretty sure many developed country partners are interested into this. And perhaps it's also something that we can likewise look into the future. GMOs and biotechnology, while we have placed that in our magazine, it doesn't necessarily mean it's an endorsement. We would like to make a clarification of that. There is the Cartagena Protocol, wherein which, following from the CBD, there is such kind of an agreement that governs on the management of GMOs and the proper use of biotechnology. ACB's position is fundamentally to assist countries as to how their policies are attuned to the compliance to the Cartagena Protocol. And in fact, one of the things that we have done is within the ASEAN region, there is a guide with respect to the use of GMOs. Now, what ECB did, one of the key steps of ECB's effort is that try to incorporate from this GMO guide, the ASEAN guide on GMOs, try to reconcile and make it consistent, but try to consider the provisions of the Cartagena Protocol. And in that sense, we've done some work with the other ASEAN working group, particularly on agriculture, who have jurisdiction towards GMOs. So within this structure, the complex structure of the ASEAN, we've tried to complement efforts that is being done and try to promote that there is the Cartagena Protocol, there are safety features, there are certain guidelines that should be recognized as countries are signatories to this, and that we would like to see that many or if not all of the provisions can be considered in the other ASEAN working group that have jurisdictions or deals mainly on these issues. And that we're trying to work with. With respect to, of course, the sustainable business effort, we do support that. And we're glad to know that there is such kind of a survey that's being done by the Price Waterhouse. And I think this is a follow-through to the McKinsey report that I've done prior to the Nagoya. There was a global survey was undertaken to look into the understanding of the business sector towards biodiversity conservation. And the McKinsey report revealed quite an interesting outcome. That basically the business sector is supportive to it, but their understanding of biodiversity is rather something that needs to be really further addressed, because it seems to be very, it's all about corporate social responsibility. It's all about making sure that, that they are perceived to be environment friendly. But we want more than that. We want to see that apart from just corporate social responsibility, they really embed a number of conservation principles perhaps in their processes for manufacturing particular products. And we do hope that this survey that Price Waterhouse is looking will probably look into deeper as to how really the private sector can be engaged and make them really not just environment friendly, but incorporate some of the basic principles for biodiversity conservation in their operations. And I think that would be a welcome. Thank you.
Anybody wants to contribute? Opinion? Comments? Well, I have one. Yes? Yes, please.
So this is the question regarding GMO biodiversity. As a writer on science, and I've written some articles on biotechnology, and based on our scientists' explanation and some observations also, and they said that GMO or biotechnology is not against biodiversity. For example, there's now this controversial biotech BT talong. They said BT talong is full of insecticides. They spray insecticides on the plant every other day, or 72 times during the plantation of one crop. So with the emergence of the BT talong, you don't have to spray insecticides on the eggplant. So you lessen the spray of insecticide, and in this you encourage the presence of insects around the farm. So when we went to the farms where there are this field testing right now, with so many insects around the farms or around the plants. So this explains that this shows that GMO or biotech is not against biodiversity. And besides, the NCBP, or the body, the interagency body, which sees to it that these events or products which come out of GMO or biotechnology protect the environment and the people. They really are strict. It is really strict in implementing its rules and regulations on the safety of GMO on the environment and on the people. That's all. Thank you.
Any other contributions? We go to the next question. I'm panning to my left. Anybody else? please signify. Yes, please. Go ahead. Please, and then
I would be interested to ask about whether ACB is trying to develop or has developed a monitoring system. Since we have now a lot of data at ACB, we should be able to use this data as baseline, and then maybe with a monitoring system, see if what's the trend now. Although we know that we have not met the biodiversity conservation target globally, we should, if there is none yet, develop a system where we know whether our policy responses are enough, or if our protected area system in place is enough to address the state of our biodiversity, which is quite sad. Thank you.
Rod, you want to respond
to the entire process of not only assessing, but down the line, what we would like to really target is build a good set of information and data that would allow us to really track as to how we're progressing. So what we're saying is that perhaps before we had difficulty from a regional and even from a country basis to really state how have we fared in biodiversity conservation. And the past 10 years have provided us a lot of valuable lessons. The key to the whole thing is how much information that is available to you that would allow you to track as to how you're progressing. What we've done is, we hope, is a start of having put all of this information together. And from here, and hopefully that's how we would like to look at it, use this as a foundation to assist countries. It's one of the key mandates of ACB, to provide information to governments as to how we are progressing with respect to biodiversity conservation. The very source of this information also is coming from governments themselves, because sometimes the key issue that arises is that where did that source come from? If one group would say, saying that we are decreasing our forests at an alarming rate, where did that information come from? We try to, as much as possible, get and have many of the information that we collected validated, and at the same time mulled over by the governments themselves, coming from other sources. And precisely one of the reasons that, one of the process that we have taken in the write-up of this report is that we brought in as many sources of information as we can, but our platform are coming from official sources. And from the official sources, we try to ask them, are this information up to date? Are they validated? And if they are, we will use them in this context. So when they have done so, here is the product. So what we're saying is that this could now be a good start for us to lead towards what Blas is saying, that perhaps we can now have baseline information to be able to build not just data to tell us what the state is, but perhaps use this data to build, to somehow project what would be the implications or the trend for the future coming from these sets of information. And we do hope that the process that we've taken will be a good foundation that would hopefully lead to this process for the region and to be of service to the countries and to the other concerned sectors who may wish to use this information. By the way, that's why we flashed here the Biodiversity Information System Service that is made available to everyone. You can access it, and for anyone who's interested, you can just go to our website and click on it, and you will have all of this information available to you.
anyway.
The question would go around, where do we go from here? We've identified the problem is people, greed, progress. The drivers are money and habitation, corporations. The implementers are weak It's called governments, not necessarily just ours. Now you've introduced the Nagoya Protocol. Is it possible to actually implement, how would you say, violators or penalize violators? Because after all, if you don't act now, it will be too late. Now, you've identified and emphasized, and many times over, that we have not even identified many of the biodiversity products, plants. We don't even know more. We don't know enough of the density and the products the biocenters are producing currently. So our ignorance drives us to ruin what we have. With the world, the way we're going, what do we do next? Do we sit and talk some more? Do we generate even more awareness? What does media do? You have done your work. How do we do ours?
Yeah, how do we do ours? You're addressing it to everybody else also.
Well, we're all sitting here. Don't look at me. Look at the guy beside you. I'm not the instigator. I am friend, not foe. But we're going to come and have a free lunch. What do we do next to save Mother Earth? I guess that draws a deep silence.
As the saying goes, half of the battle is always won. If you know what the issues are, then that's perhaps not good enough. The next challenge is, how do you translate those information so that you will be able to come up with the right action? And I think what ECB is trying to do based on its mandate is to produce this information, and at the same time, given with the resources that it has, try to do some doable actions that would contribute to some of this. There are several things that we do know. One is that we may not have many resources or full resources to undertake all of the activities or all of the probable actions that have been identified to address biodiversity. Because it will never be enough, even if, regardless of the amount, even if we pour in the richest country for perhaps producing or having all of these resources to invest on the key issues of biodiversity, it will never be enough. But there are certain things within communities, within certain sectors within ourselves that we can do, from capacity building to local governments becoming aware of what are the right steps in order for them to anticipate, as what you said, disasters. If they will only channel perhaps their resources of planning, trying to invest to anticipate the probable outcomes of any disaster, just as trying to prevent the probable outcomes of a major collapse of an ecosystem, that would mean already a lot. And this is where perhaps the other sectors can likewise play in. I think the key to a successful biodiversity or natural resources conservation effort is what you call the commonness of understanding and effort. If every one of us, in a particular community, for instance, that may be threatened by a particular, by a probable calamity, or by threatened, for instance, by food insecurity because they have over-harvested perhaps their resources, they are the ones who take the actions themselves. And there are past lessons wherein which communities have turned around from a point wherein which they were almost on the brink of collapse to a point wherein which they are able to showcase how they can work together and at the same time address those issues. And I guess if we can only highlight many of this, then perhaps it gives us that perspective that there is something that can be done. The NGO community here, I think there are a number of lessons from their efforts in which they have shown working together with communities, local governments, as to how they're able to address biodiversity concerns. Maybe we can support them. Not in terms only of providing resources to continue with their work, but perhaps getting the lessons from what they have learned and have it translated perhaps into a policy that governments themselves would recognize that if this community can do it, why can't all the other communities can do it? If they have done it at less cost, why can't other communities do it the same? So these small steps would probably mean more rather than investing so much and then at the end of the day, you come up with being short of meeting that objective. And I would confidently say that within the region and within the Philippines itself, there are vast learnings that we can take from many of the communities that have tried to address this adverse situation of threatened biodiversity resources.
May I have
Yes, I'd like to respond to that very simple question that requires very complex answer. The biodiversity outlook tells us where we are, and that is very important because if you don't know where you are, you wouldn't know where you are going. And in biodiversity, it is very difficult to know where you are because it is something that is extremely difficult to measure. So I guess this is why this outlook is very critical. And we all know that you cannot manage anything that you cannot measure. So measuring something is the very step towards managing something. Now, where do we go from here? There are different pathways or strategies on how to address biodiversity. The drivers are the same, but the degree of the drivers, the context of the drivers differs from country to country, it differs from region to region, so it really depends. But one thing is clear, we cannot do more of the same. We cannot do more of what we have been doing in the past because this will have very limited success. The fact that the situation now is we are losing biodiversity at an unprecedented rate means that we have to do something different from what we have been doing in the past. And something different really depends on the situation. A good example is in the Philippines. Philippines, we have more than 100 protected areas. And our mindset before was, these are protected areas and the name implies we should not allow any commercial activity inside. This is an area that we have to strictly protect. But that becomes counterproductive because it becomes unsustainable. Because there's nothing to sustain the protection in the area unless people get benefits from the protection, unless we generate something out of the biodiversity in that area. So these are changes in the mindset of policymakers like government, like the Philippine government, like the department, that we need to see more and more so that we can address more and more effectively the loss in biodiversity. And one of the most critical factor really is involvement. We need to have more people involved in biodiversity. We need to sell biodiversity to everybody. Last year, there was a big international conference in Norway about biodiversity, about selling biodiversity, about the PR aspect of biodiversity. And do you know what is the biggest problem in selling biodiversity as concluded by that conference? It is actually the word biodiversity. Nobody understands what is biodiversity. So they are saying maybe we should call it a more common name that people understand, like nature. People understand what's nature, but how many people understand biodiversity? In fact, there was a survey several years ago about us in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And do you know, majority of us, even in the department, does not understand what is biodiversity. You go out of this hotel, the very first person you meet, ask him about biodiversity. Do you think he would understand what is biodiversity? So maybe we have the media here, so that's very critical for increasing involvement, the way we explain, the way we tell people about biodiversity should be in a way that people understand, in a way that people can relate to. And I think that's very important in moving forward. Thank you very much.
And there are people there who are good in knowing what we have and can do that and can patent them. We might end up someday waking up not owning what we have. No? I understand that we don't anymore own ilang-ilang or the ilang-ilang fragrance because it has been patented by somebody else. No?
The perfume company in France.
Yes, no. So this is my fear. So I think we should, Blas is correct, we have to start with a database, assess what we have. And we will be happy to participate in that effort.
Anybody else? Yes, Robert. Robert Posadas. That's the mic.
Robert Posadas.
Tap it. Yeah, it's okay.
Anyway, Robert Posadas, and I'm neither a friend nor a foe, but a fence seeker.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, I think we can make people understand more about diversity if we relate it to food production. Because after all, this is, I think, a race for mankind's survival. And what is survival without food? So if people can understand it directly related to food production, I think we can have a common basis for making more people aware of what the biodiversity is. So related to that is, can we be more proactive in that since this is a scientifically led world, we can have a more cooperation on scientific approach to food production. Because I think this science now is leading the world and in all fields. And if we can have more countries base their cooperation more on scientific approach to food production, then we can have more impact on making people understand and be conscious of biodiversity. So the question is, what has the ASEAN Biodiversity Center done on more proactive research on scientific food production?
On the local level, I think the OSD and the Department of Agriculture itself have all their scientific agencies doing these things. So in a way, what ECB is doing is try to work with them. ECB, however, does not do specific scientific studies on technical issues, but rather our role, as I've said, our mandate is more on facilitating and coordinating efforts with respect to biodiversity conservation. But you are right in saying that perhaps focus may have to be made on food production and food security, and how do you link science to that. And from a standpoint of biodiversity conservation, there is a global effort that is trying to really connect policy and science to work together, meaning if policies or policymakers are to make and are to craft a number of their policy statements or policy work, it has to be scientifically based, and therefore the academic community, scientific community should be able to connect with policymakers and bring whatever information they have so that it can be translated rightly and that hopefully appropriate policies can be promulgated. And at the global level, there is this effort they call the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that has already been approved by the United Nations General Assembly. Its function is similar to what is being done with the IPCC on climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they are the ones that's quite independent from governments that come up with scientifically based information that would provide advice and come up with an assessment as to what the state is in the case of biodiversity, for biodiversity. So that is being formulated, that has already been endorsed, and in the near future, such panel will be created. Now, what is the significance of this effort? The significance of this effort is now there is a growing recognition and there is also increasing effort among countries to recognize that policies would now have to be crafted on the basis of a robust and sound scientific information. In general, and more specific, science understanding its breadth among sectors, meaning food, science and technology, and all the others. They would have to work together as well. They would have to connect with each other to be able to come up with a better perspective of what will be the right policies that we can advise governments. I think many of us, it goes beyond argument, that many of us recognizes that our resources are finite, that our needs are growing, and we need science to fundamentally try to balance the whole thing out. The key issue is that are we using the right science to be able to address many of these issues? And there are far more implications on the role of science, like it may be right now, but what about 2 or 3 years later? What would be its implications? It may have some effects as well, adverse effects for that matter, on many of the productions that we have. So, in a way, as we deal with a lot of uncertainties, we have to be conscious of the fact that science, for whatever value it has, would have to be taken also with certain precautions. I think the precisely the precautionary principles are embedded in many of these international agreements. That's what they say, science is a two-edged sword. It could work for you, it could work against you. It's a question, therefore, of how do we make the right assessment as to which scientific information are we going to use for the right reason. And I think that applies not only for food production, but as well as for all other endeavors that society as a whole will engage when we deal with science.
Secretary Ignacio has an addition to make.
Relating biodiversity to food is one of the most effective ways of explaining what the biodiversity is all about. In our own language, in Tagalog, sabi nga nila, unless ilapit mo sa tiyan ng tao, hindi importante. Hindi mo ikita na importante. So, kailangan mo lapit sa tiyan ng tao. But, and the best way of doing that is to really tell stories. And this is just an example of a story. Two of the species that people fear are bats and snakes. In fact, they are associated with evil things. The bats, the snakes, and people tend to kill them whenever they see bats and snakes. But without bats and snakes, we're going to have food shortages. We're going to have crop failures. We're going to have shortage of rice. We're going to have shortage of food. Why? Because these are the species that eat agricultural pests. Rats, grasshoppers, and things like that. Bats eat millions of pests every night. Imagine if there were no bats.
for snakes.
The agricultural production will just be overwhelmed by pests. And we will all go hungry. Thank you very much.
That would be exactly pest control management. Integrated pest control management. Any other contribution? Otherwise, I would ask the chair to allow me to make contribution, divert from my job. Any other comments, please? Or is everybody hungry by now? Right. Let me now, since nobody is raising his hand, let me now try to go into what we have gone through over the last 40 minutes or so. What comes out here is a need for information in this age of information and globalization. And you need accurate information in real time. Because unless we have that, we cannot act. Some of the things we know will happen is something unpredictable. The latest experience of Chiba prefecture in Japan is exactly an example. And some people, even in the Philippines, I know, have thought that this has something to do with biodiversity. Maybe in the end, yes, because of climate change, because the earth crust comes up and just causes all these changes, these earthquakes. But maybe also one of the first things they should have is a well-rounded information, the mega information and anything else. And what they should have done is look at all the geological risk factors involved whenever businessmen want to put up a subdivision or a residential area or even a power plant. Unless they do that, they will always run the risks of getting some kind of a lash from nature, backlash from nature. The other thing that comes into mind with all that information's necessity towards our responsible reaction towards the loss of biodiversity is how to make our businessmen come up with this, not only include businessmen but also policymakers, to consider the economic, social and cultural, political dimensions of the environment, because those are totally, they total up to biodiversity, whether we like it or not. The present age of technical advancement in information, communication is very helpful if we know how to do it. But unless we know how to really put out responsible information, and this is where media comes in, to be able to give people the truth on what they should do, they will not be able to respond. So it's up to us, and this is where media plays a very big role. And this is where I call responsibility of media to be able to do it, because media must now vet all information coming in. We must not allow just anybody, any Tom, Dick, and Harry to come up on the internet and come up with his own blog, because that is very hard to vet. The last point that I think we made here is the bad news is there indeed, that all our human efforts to get all these vital pieces of data are all geared to. However, no one man, no one agency, no one bureaucracy can do it alone. And therefore, we need to spread the word that, hey, we all must participate. After all, we don't have any other place to go to except this planet. Is that endorsed or approved by? Well, any other question? I hope I was able to capsulize that, because otherwise, to get all what Rod and the Undersecretary Ignacio said would take me another 4 or 5 hours. Anything else? Well, I guess that's it, huh? What's the next one? Lunch.
Lunch.
Lunch is the next agenda. Next on the agenda. Thank you very much.